Hello, everyone, and welcome to the ALN Academy Talks. This is Angelica. The ALN Academy Talks aim to promote conversations on rule of law, governance, and sustainability across Africa for the development on the continent. And today, we focus on renewable energy. We are delighted today to host, together with the French Chamber of Commerce in Kenya, Mathieu Ecofier, Regional Councillor for Sustainable Development for East Africa and Indian Ocean from the French Treasury, and lead of the French Club for Renewable Energy and Sustainable Cities in East Africa. We are also delighted to host today Amin Musa, partner at ALN Kenya and Jarwala and Kana, and head of the Projects and Infrastructure Department at the firm. Mathieu and Amin, it is an absolute pleasure to host you today. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Mathieu, let's start with you. Which is the main objective and scope of the French Club?
Okay, so the French Club for Renewable Energy and Sustainable Cities was founded in 2016, so far, 6 years ago now, by the French Minister for Environment and Energy. It was initially focused on renewable energy and then expanded to sustainable cities, so meaning water, sanitation, urban transportation, housing, because of course of the challenges around this sector and the growing interest of French companies about sustainable cities in the region. And now it has around 200 members, so private French companies, public agencies, and it's coordinated by the French embassy here in Nairobi. So the group aims to bring together the French actors of renewable energy and sustainable cities to promote an integrated French offer aimed at local players, public actors or private actors. So it helps to identify the dynamics and obstacles to renewable energy and sustainable cities. And when possible, when needed, it implements action toward private companies or toward public actors in the region, in the East African region, to improve the intervention framework and the role French companies can play in the region. So basically, in practice, we share information on market opportunities in the region and call for tenders, fundings, and we look at promising projects on which to position French technologies and French expertise with the support or not, with the support, if needed, of French fundings.
Okay.
No, that's incredibly interesting, Mathieu, and once again, thank you very much for participating in this discussion. It would be useful to understand what you see the role of the French government, but also beyond that, the role of French corporates, French financial institutions in developing the renewable energy sector in sub-Saharan Africa. What do you see that role between the various French players?
Yeah. Okay, so I will try to answer for Africa, but I will mainly focus on Kenya because it's where we are now and where we are working. It's also a good example of the kind of support France can give to renewable energy projects because Kenya is like a priority for France in the region and in Africa. And I think Kenya is a good example also because it has already achieved a lot in terms of having a sustainable electricity system, at least, with access to energy growing in the last decade, quite impressive, from 40% in the early 2010s to almost, I think, 75% in more recently. And in terms also of decarbonization and greening of the energy mix, I mean, last year it was more than 90%. The Kenyan electricity mix was more than 90% renewable. So Kenya is quite a role model about that. So it's a good example. So to come back to the support France can give in terms of funding, it's quite broad. It can be public funding. I mean, when we speak about public funding, it is gov to gov. So French public money going to public-led project. It can be public funding to private companies, and it can be also investment by French private company, by French private actors or funds. And in terms of the modalities, it can be grants, it can be loans, it can be equity, it can be guarantees, it can also be technical assistance, because in a lot of project funding without technical assistance is, let's say, less useful. So maybe if we want some details for the public funding. So France has been a historic partner in supporting Africa and for renewable energy, especially in Kenya. In fact, the French Development Agency has been really at the forefront of this support to help Kenya reach the situation it has reached today, with over 1 billion euro. In fact, Kenya is the biggest portfolio of AFD in the energy sector worldwide, not only in Africa but worldwide. AFD was present in all the electricity value chain, so for generation, transmission, distribution, last mile distribution, also off-grid, mini-grid. So speaking about mini-grid, a good example, maybe a flagship project, a recent one, will be the Green Mini-Grid project that AFD is implementing. It supports technical assistance and investment grants for the development of private mini-grids in Kenya. Thanks to this program, more than 50,000 people are now having access to electricity. Maybe on another segment, in the transmission segment, so the French branch of GE, so the GE Grid Solution, is involved in a 100 million euros project to reinforce the transport network of KETRACO, so the Kenyan transport operator for electricity, to better integrate renewable energy, especially geothermal energy. And this project is supported by a soft loan, concessional loan from the French Treasury. So outside of Kenya, I think it's worth noting also the Just Energy Transition Partnership that was signed around COP26 between the government of South Africa, France, Germany, the UK, and the US, along with the European Union. It's aimed at helping South Africa transition from coal and other fossil fuel to more sustainable energy sources, let's say in exchange of more funding from the partner countries. So it's 8.5 billion USD funding, and France has committed around 1 billion on this amount. And during the last African Union European Summit last February in Brussels, there was like a common ambition to extend this approach, this kind of partnerships, to other African countries, including Kenya. So that was for public fundings. For public funding to private actors, so we have Proparco, which is let's say the private sector arm of AFD. It has quite numerous and quite diversified operation in the energy sector in Africa. And so in Kenya, one example would be the financing of the Lake Turkana wind farm, the IPP, with over it was not alone, of course, with over DFI like the European Investment Bank. But Proparco also support, let's say, smaller like SMEs on smaller scale. In Kenya, for example, with a company called Paygo, it has invested in Paygo Energy. It's a solar home system company with payment, as its name can say, with a pay-as-you-go system. Credit lines are also an important source of funding and an important way for France to fund a smaller scale project for renewable energy. With, for example, a 150 million euros credit line from AFD to TDB to finance energy and climate project in the East Africa region. And in Africa in general, so IFD and Proparco have launched a program that's called the SUNREF program in partnership with local banks. It combines grants with credit lines and technical assistance to finance projects tied to energy efficiency, renewable energy, and natural resources. And it allows companies, SMEs or bigger companies, to purchase higher quality equipment, save cost, save energy, and at the end also become more competitive. Maybe lastly, in terms of private, let's say private to private funding, so French companies have been strong player in the energy system, electricity system in Africa, in many countries in the region, with investment in new projects, so but also in investment in locally grown companies. So if we take the example of Kenya, we have the two main French utilities, historic utilities, ENGIE and EDF, that have both made significant investment in locally grown companies involved in Minigrid or solar home system, for example, Mobilsol, BB Box, or Sun Culture. And with those investments, of course, they are helping those companies to grow. We also have several French IPP, independent power producer, that have been involved in Kenya or in the region, so such as Total or Voltalia, mainly in the solar PV business, or Hydroneo, which is more involved in mini hydro business. And we also have a French private investment fund. So the list can be long, but we can mention Meridiam, E3 Capital, Stoa, or Creadev. They are all based and active in Africa, in fact, in Nairobi in particular, and they have been involved to fund renewable energy projects across Africa. For example, Meridiam is funding a geothermal project in Ethiopia.
Excellent. Clearly, there is a shift over the last decade by the French governments and the French private sector from the traditional Francophone Africa towards Eastern and Southern Africa from what you're describing.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that France is abandoning West Africa or Francophone Africa, but it's clearly like to have an intervention that's continent-wide. Clearly, Africa in general is a priority for France in terms of funding and of development, and it's all Africa: West, East, South, North Africa, of course, also.
No, that's good to hear. The other thing we find is many countries in sub-Saharan Africa are grappling with figuring out their energy policy. What is the role of private sector in the energy sector? How do you deal with the value chain from distribution, transmission, generation? How do you procure projects? Do you use a feed-in tariff model? Do you use an auction system? So these are key fundamental policy issues that sub-Saharan African countries are grappling with as we speak today. What do you see are the lessons, positive or negative lessons, that can be learned from the policies that have been developed in Europe and France over the last decade in terms of enhancing and promoting renewable energy? But with that, we have seen examples, for example, in Germany, in Spain, where you have seen consumer prices go up significantly as a result of this shift from, frankly, cheaper thermal and coal power to potentially more expensive renewable powers. And then there are questions about sustainability of pricing, etc. What do you see are these lessons that we can learn in Africa today from the lessons Europe and specifically France has learned over the last decade in terms of decarbonizing its energy portfolio?
Okay, but that's a long and difficult question. But we'll try to give a few modest insights.
Sure.
So maybe before dealing with renewable energy policy, a few words about the organization of the European power system.
Sure.
In France and in the EU, because in fact the policy is largely European, the regulation is European, is from the EU. The energy sector has undergone what we call unbundling between the different segments of the value chain, so being generation, transmission, distribution, supply, and trading. So it's now a system based on a regulated access to a network, the electricity network, with a charge for the use of this network. So the charge is determined by the government upon proposal of the regulator. In France, it's the Energy Regulatory Commission. And before the, let's say, the current acute energy crisis with the Ukraine crisis, so those charges accounted for around 40% of the final price paid to consumer. So it's a system that let's say both liberalized but also highly regulated, because you have almost 40% of the price for the consumer that's regulated, that's set by the regulator. So that's for the general organization. In practice, in France, the segment of electricity generation is open, but it's still largely dominated by EDF, which is the historical vertically integrated French utility company that's large, that majority, more than 80% owned by the French state. It's mainly because in France, power generation is largely from nuclear, 70%, and all the nuclear reactors in France are operated by EDF. But it doesn't mean that there are no other companies that do doing electricity generation in France. So we also have a system operator, a transmission system operator, that's also a system operator in charge of balancing the networks. So it's called RTE, and a distribution network operator, that's ERDF. So that will be in Kenya, KETRACO for RTE, and the distribution part of KPLC for ERDF. So both are owned by EDF, but they are completely separated in their operation to comply with the European regulation. So, and in terms of, like, a broader strategy, of overlapping strategy, we have a multi-annual energy plan that sets the priority for government action in the next 10 years. It's divided in two 5 years period. So that was for the overall organization. I think it's important to understand. And to come back to renewable energy. So renewable energy policy in Europe is set around what we call feed-in tariff. So what we call feed-in tariff, in fact, in Europe are both so the rate of the feed-in tariff that are set, but there are also feed-in tariff that are where the rate is set after an auction, after a tender that will be based on the lowest bidder for the feed-in tariff. They are, in fact, not completely set feed-in tariff. They are based on market. It's a market premium. We'll come back about that, because in Europe, in France, we do have a power market. So it changes things compared to Kenya. And if we want also to have a broader look around the energy policy and energy efficiency policy, we also have a tax credit, for example, for the installation of heat pumps, and a zero interest loan program for rehabilitation of homes, so that energy efficiency can be improved in residential homes. So to come back to this premium tariff for renewable energy, it's market based, because it's guaranteed for 15 or 20 years, depending on the renewable technology. But producers must sell their energy to the market, and they receive after, let's say, a premium, an additional remuneration that's paid by the historic utility, so EDF, in the form of a monthly premium. And as every renewable energy policy, the premium is set so that the developer of renewable energy can get, let's say, a reasonable return on invested capital. But if the market price exceeds the reference tariff, the developers, the IPPs, they must reimburse the difference to EDF, which act as a state agency on this.
So you're allowed to make a return up to a certain point,
yes,
and then
exactly.
above that, it goes back to government.
Exactly, depending on the price of electricity, because again, we do have power markets in Europe. So about your question about auction or feed-in tariff, I mean, the introduction of auction to set the level or to have a set rate for everybody is linked to the size of the project. Basically, it depends on the technology, but smaller project like 1 or 2 standards wind turbine, it would get a set premium.
Right.
For bigger project, you would go through auctions. Like for big solar project, the same. And it's also it also depends on the technology. For the less mature technology, for example, biogas or marine energies, you will have a set
feed-in tariff.
Yes, a set feed-in tariff, but of course revise depending on the evolution of the prices of the technology. So of course, I mean, it's different to draw clear lesson, because the electricity system is organized differently in Europe compared to Kenya and other African countries. It's also organized differently between European countries. But for our matters, the main difference would be the existence of a power market in Europe. It's Europe-wide, but it's also with a price that's different in each countries. And in Kenya, so the electricity system is not mature enough, is not deep and liquid enough to have now an energy market. For example, I mean, the capacity is less than 3 gigawatts. So in December 2021, it almost reached 3 gigawatts, but we're not there yet. And in France, it's more than 130 gigawatts for a country of the similar size. So of course, it's an ambition of the Kenyan government to move toward an energy market, but we're not here yet. So again, I mean, it's difficult to draw clear lesson about the mention that you had about the problems linked with renewable energy, like introduction, renewable energy growth. Of course, in Europe, in every country, you mentioned Germany or Spain, but also in France, the rapid introduction of intermittent, of variable renewable energy has not been without issues. So you mentioned a few issues. I mean, there was a cost to connect the new generation to the network. There is a new balancing cost for the system, because those generations are more variable depending on the weather. There is the increase of the cost to consumer, because those premiums are passed through consumer. They pay at the end those premiums to renewable energy producer. We're speaking about billions of euros every year in each country. It's not insignificant. And lastly, the increased variability of the market price of energy in Europe, especially in countries like Germany. We have seen period of negative prices in the electricity system. So when there was like a lot of wind, a lot of sun, and low demand, we had prices that were negative. So of course, it had a huge impact on the financial stability of the system.
What do you mean by negative prices for our audience?
You will get paid.
You get paid.
You will get paid to consume the electricity. Of course, it was not
like negative interest rates.
Yes, it was not the consumer that was benefiting for negative price. It was at the market level, but you had negative prices because you can't stop like that a wind turbine or solar panel or a nuclear reactor, by the way, also. So that was an issue. That was more an issue before, like the current energy crisis, where the increase of the prices of gas have led to less period of negative prices. But there is a huge variability, and the system needs to adapt. So clearly, I mean, the question of auction is quite, I mean, let's not say that it's quite easy, but the answer is what the Kenyan government is planning to do is for mature big project. I mean, it's a good idea to have auction, because it ensures that the utility, the consumer at the end gets the lowest price possible. For less mature technology, it's better to have a set rate, so you can encourage this technology to decrease its prices. But after the question, I think it is a broader question: is how to adapt the electricity system to more intermittent renewable energy, because both technologies, both solar, wind generation, are getting mainstream. I mean, in many countries, including Kenya, it's now 10, 20%, 30% of electricity generation. So of course there are solutions. It can be technologies, stronger, smarter network, electricity storage, battery, pump hydro. But it's also like new regulatory framework. It's also a new market mechanism. And we have seen that in Europe, it was not straightforward to design a system that and it's still not straightforward, that can lead to more renewable energy in the grid, have a system that's stable technically, that's where you have energy security, so you don't depend on one country for import, and where you have a price at the end for the consumer that's socially and economically acceptable. So it's quite difficult, and also African countries and Kenya are moving toward this direction. In fact, for speaking about the regulatory framework and the master planning, AFD is supporting KETRACO and KPLC and the Ministry of Energy in Kenya in the integration of more renewable energy. But there is not, I don't think there is one model that can fit all countries. Even between European countries, we have different energy mix, different energy policies, the same overreaching European regulation. And if I maybe more personal insight, I mean, we can say that more private expertise is needed for that. But the solution, as we have seen in Europe, is not always a complete unbundling, liberalization or privatization of the system. Especially on less mature system where the rate of electrification is still growing, where you want to increase the energy that's consumed at consumer level, because at the end that's a political decision. I mean, the tariff that's paid by the consumer, the energy mix, it's a political decision. So it should be something that decided at the political
But
level.
ultimately, from what you're saying, this is an idea about getting the balance correct. The balance when it comes to unbundling, in terms of how much do you unbundle, what role does the private sector play versus the public sector. I guess in many ways it's good to hear that you don't have complete extreme situations where you do have still a significant degree of government support, but it's about finding the balance. And I think from many of the things you suggested, a lot of this was about getting the balance. So supply-demand planning in East Africa especially has been a problem. So finding that balance, and I'm glad to hear that the French government is in fact assisting KPLC and KETRACO with the supply-demand issues.
With the technical assistance.
Even on the procurement, it was interesting to hear you say how there is a balance between the outright auction systems for larger, more complex projects, but on the other hand, for smaller, simpler projects, the feed-in tariff policy is still being used, maybe for smaller wind, biomass. And I think that's probably the key lesson for sub-Saharan African governments, is there is no one size that fits all. Ultimately, you need that balance between auctions, feed-in tariff, proper planning, balance on the unbundling, balance between public sector participation, private sector participation, and hopefully, we will continue to work towards that balance, which I guess continues to change as populations grow, as economies grow. So it's useful to see, whilst the markets can be quite different in maturities, many of the issues are still the same.
Yeah, it was a debate.
And therefore, there are still plenty of lessons for us to learn from some of the more mature markets.
Yeah, exactly. Now in Europe, it's an ongoing debate, and now in the media, well, like the issue of market design about energy, it's something that's not straightforward, and there are of course a disagreement between countries. So maybe to come back on the issue of the auction, I mean it's again, we have seen in Europe or in other African countries, not even for like bigger projects, it's not a straightforward solution, because we have seen projects or countries where we had aggressive bidding, very low bidding, and after a developer that didn't have the technical or the financial capability to just lead the project, to complete the project. So you have to design a system where you have strong deterrence mechanism, so that the developer that gets the lowest bid will complete the project, and you won't get stuck. You won't be with stuck project that will never be completed.
In fact, it's probably a significant issue, not just in the renewable energy sector, but just generally in the infrastructure sector, where ultimately to have an auction system, firstly, the government needs to have the capacity to develop a well-structured auction, the request for proposal, the technical, the legal, the environmental input that has to go into it, because governments need to spend that time, money, and human capital to develop a well-structured auction system. And as you correctly say, when they are not well-structured, you find results like you have suggested, where the focus is on the lowest price, but the developer with the lowest price actually may not have the technical and financial capability. And had the auction system factored in technical financial capability in addition to price, then you have a greater chance of success, because we have seen too many failures in the auction systems, the tender systems generally across infrastructure projects. So in a way, it's not surprising that the half a dozen or so key projects in the renewable sector in Kenya, and we've been involved in a number of them, like the Lake Turkana wind power project, the Kipeto energy project, the Malindi solar projects, were developed through the feed-in tariff structure rather than the auction system. Moving away a little, I guess, from general energy policy, we are starting to see, but at a very nascent and early stages, some activity again in what I would call the carbon credit markets and the red markets. Again, I think trying to draw comparisons from what you're seeing in Europe and France specifically, and what you see then happening in sub-Saharan Africa, what the opportunities are in these specific markets. What are your thoughts specifically around the whole red and carbon credit system to promote renewable energy?
Yes, yes. So carbon or red, what we call red credit, are indeed I think a promising source of funding for renewable energy project or for climate green project in general in Africa. I think it can provide what is much needed finance for green project, and they also can be part of the financing flow from developed to developing country. I'm talking about the 100 billion USD per year that was, let's say, promised by developed country to developing countries during the COP and the international climate negotiation. So those ideas have been around for quite a time now. In practice, let's say that it was more difficult to have like real projects on the ground that were growing thanks to those credits. We had in 2012 a crash of the prices of the credit under what we call the clean development mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol. So the prices went to almost zero. So it was, with other like issues, I think it was a good example. But again, it's not straightforward to design an international market between all the countries or between several countries that is working for those credits, because there are issues of double counting, of certification. So there are many issues. And like it's mainly dealt during the international negotiations, so the COP and COP 25. It was a big issue during COP 25 and the next COP, including in Glasgow last year. There have been progress, but those negotiations have not been able to completely solve the pending issues. So that's not something that's of course that's very promising, but on like international level and let's say gov to gov level, it's quite slow to materialize. Nevertheless, there is currently a market for those credits. I mean, it exists. It's including and I think I don't have the figures, but mainly from so companies, so private companies or institutions, banks that voluntarily choose to offset their emissions. So we have a market for those credits. But today the price, so it's useful, it can be used, but the price today, I mean, it's again, I don't have the most recent figures, and it depends on a lot of factors. There is not a unified price for a ton of carbon today at the international level, but it's usually less than $5 per ton. And there is also a high price for certification, high transaction cost. So it means that today the effect is relatively marginal on the bankability of the project. It will help a project to be to break even, but it's not the credits are not in any project. The credits are the main source of funding, and they don't make it bankable by themselves. And also there is again a high transaction cost, so that could be useful for big projects, but for small projects it's difficult. It's difficult for them to be financially viable.
In fact, that is the frustration many people have, because firstly, lenders are not willing to count the possible revenues from these credits under a lender financial model. And so the project, as you correctly say, must be bankable on its own without factoring the revenues. And then for smaller projects, it can be very time consuming and very costly to go through the process of getting first accredited and then going through the certification process. And I guess the question is then, until we can make the structure work better for some of these projects, whereby revenues can be better defined, the setting up costs and the operating costs in relation to carbon and red credits can be more efficient and cost effective, it is unlikely in the very short term we will see that transforming the market, unfortunately. Would you agree with that?
Yes, no, it's true in the short term, but I think in the medium or long term, there is hope. There is hope that they can play a bigger role, because the price of carbon, of CO2 on the different markets is increasing. I mean, in the EU, the price of the EU ETS in the recent months, in the recent year, has increased to quite high levels, and we can also hope that with stronger, easier certification process, like the financing potential of those credits can be increased. And about the certification, I mean, France is ready to provide technical assistance to countries and to private actors to help them to better use those credits in Kenya or in other African countries.
I guess for me, the last question for you is, what do you say to this argument that you hear emerging or less developed economies in Africa putting out, saying, it's great that Europe and North America, who initially developed using coal, natural gas, thermal energy, dirty energy, and developed and got to a certain level in terms of their GDPs and economic growth, uh, but are now, through their restrictions on financing projects, actually restricting the ability of continents like Africa and some parts of Asia to be able to grow using cheap thermal energy in much the same way that economies like Germany and the United States were able to develop through cheap, dirty thermal energy. What do you say to that argument that, on one hand, whilst there is a clear global and environmental benefit to moving towards renewable energy, that movement has the potential of stifling growth in economies like Africa, where growth is most needed, especially given the continuing growth of our populations? What do you say to that argument?
No, of course. I mean, after it's an issue of multilateral negotiation. I mean, after it's true, and I think that France agree that's there is a need for Africa and for less developed countries to have more flexibility about the use of fossil fuel. Because priority is also increasing energy access, having affordable energy, because energy is needed. I mean, it's a fundamental right to access clean and affordable energy. It's true, for example, for clean cooking. We spoke about clean cooking, and for clean cooking, at some point, it's mean moving from biomass to gas. That's a fossil fuel, but cleaner. That's using unsustainable wood and deforestation in the forest. After the argument that thermal energy is cheaper is, let's say, not always true. I mean, we have seen that in Kenya. I mean, in Kenya, Kenya doesn't produce fossil fuel. They need to import the petrol products. It has a huge impact on the economy. I mean, it costs a lot to consumer. It costs a lot to the economy in terms of the commercial balance of the country. And we have seen that Kenya was able to reach like 90% of renewable energy. Well, speaking about only electricity, but 90% of renewable energy, because it was cheaper than the heavy fuel diesel generators that they were using before. So let's say that no, fossil fuel are not always cheaper, and most of the time they are not cheaper than renewable energy. And that's I think that the overall objective of the support France and the European Union is giving to countries like Kenya is to reach a system that's green, but that's also economically and socially acceptable for everybody.
No, excellent. Thank you for that. Angie?
So, gentlemen, this has been a very insightful conversation. Matthew, is there any parting shot?
Well, we spoke. I think we spoke about like in Kenya there is now a big debate about the renegotiation of the purchasing power agreement with all. I mean, thermal of renewable energy producer. But I think this debate and the conversation we are having just before has shown that just adding renewable energy generation to the grid is not enough to reach a sustainable energy system, to have this needed energy transition towards a system that's clean, socially, economically acceptable. And for the moment, much of the public and private investment in Africa and Kenya have gone to generation. renewable when it's in the best case, or not renewable in the worst case. But we have seen that network reinforcement, storage, off-grid, mini-grids are also important solutions, and they need to be financed, and there are opportunities, of course. And to go even further, let's not forget that, so we have focused here on electricity, but energy is not electricity only. I mean, in Kenya, the final energy consumption is only 5% electricity.
Yeah.
The rest, 95%, is biomass, the majority, and then oil products. So we also need to look at those 95%, and it means solution to electrify other energy uses, e-mobility, to move toward cleaner fuels for clean cooking, for example. So of course there are a lot of challenges about this solution. There are market challenges, there are regulatory challenges, but there are also a lot of business opportunities. And we were speaking at the start about the French club and the French company that are part of this club, and I think a lot of them are now also looking and proposing solution in those segments.
You, Amin, is there any parting shot, like the way forward for Africa based on this?
Yeah, I think just adding on to what has just been said, if you have proper planning, if you focus on the entire value chain of energy, and currently that focus has been primarily on generation, but as you correctly say, distribution, transmission, but also non-power sources, LPG and LNG has to be part of the energy mix discussion. And then I think specifically for Eastern African countries, in addition to being blessed with wind and solar resources, we are blessed with geothermal resources. So I think promoting the development and the harnessing of our geothermal resources as part of the overall energy conversation is fundamental, because I think the problem you have is when you just focus on one element, generation of wind and solar, without looking at the overall equation. That is then what leads you into the kind of discussions you just talked about, where there is talk about PPA renegotiations, etc. So I think it's fundamental for the public sector and the private sector to have a much more holistic conversation, approach, and develop much more holistic policies around energy rather than specific forms of renewable energy alone. Because if you do that, then you will have these gaps that then that create this tension between the public sector, the private sector, but more importantly, the tension that is created with the citizens of a country that's saying, why are my power costs so high? Why is my power supply so unreliable? So it is very important to have that holistic conversation on this issue.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Amin.
Thank
you very much, Matthew. Thank you to our audience. If you have any question about this session, please do not hesitate to reach out to us at info@alnacademy.org. This conversation will be available on our ALN Academy's YouTube channel and ALN Academy's podcast platform. Please remember to subscribe, and see you in our next talk. Bye.